You know those unexpected animal friendships you see online sometimes? Like, watch this baby giraffe befriend this old snow leopard. Sometimes that's how I feel about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Today we are going to look past ancient mythology into one of the modern evolutions of it, fantasy. Specifically looking at two of the authors who shaped the genre, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien and Lewis were good friends. They both taught at Oxford together, they were part of a writing group called the Inklings together, and they both shaped the modern fantasy landscape. But they disagreed on a lot of central ideas surrounding fantasy, including how to approach lore in one's works. Lore for Tolkien was kind of the end-all be-all. He basically had this language, Elvish, and he wrote a story and more stories and even more stories around it. On the other hand, you had Lewis, who was a bit more flexible. He had an allegory at the heart of most of his stories, and whatever lore would best serve the allegory, he would use. In the foreword to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien talked about the creation of Middle-earth, saying, "It was soon begun after The Hobbit was written, and before the publication in 1937, but I did not go on with this sequel, for I wished first to complete and set in order the mythology and legends of the elder days. It was primarily linguistic in inspiration, and was begun in order to provide the necessary background and history for Elvish tongues." If you're a fan of Tolkien, I actually recommend that you read the foreword in its entirety, because it gives you really interesting insight into his creative process, his interests, and the story itself. But what we see here specifically is his approach to the creation of the world. It wasn't a particular story, but the world itself. In short, it is story as a means of lore. In Lewis's most popular work, The Chronicles of Narnia, we see a different approach. First and foremost, there's a categorical difference. Lord of the Rings is high fantasy, inspired by epics like Beowulf, while Narnia are short allegorical books that are inspired by fairy tales. In fact, Lewis calls them a fairy tale in the dedication to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that's an important distinction, because the details of Narnia's lore are largely in the background, left as kind of hints and allusions. It isn't until the end of the series that you get more detail around the creation and end of the world, and even then, Magician's Nephew and Last Battle are allegories of Judeo-Christian creation and end times myths, and those aren't fully detailed, so there's still a lot left up to the imagination and interpretation of the reader. Instead, when lore is important in Lewis's works, it's because it's supporting the story and allegory. This is a big difference from Tolkien's approach. In fact, you probably have seen this quote around. This is also reflected in the creatures these authors used in their works. Tolkien did use things like goblins and dragons, which didn't originate in his works, but he did keep everything pretty tied to his own creation, or things that had their foundation in classic European texts. He didn't make everything from scratch to have a pure mythology, but he did very much value consistency. Lewis, on the other hand, did the opposite. In his works, basically anything and everything goes. I'm going to break from protocol here and read directly from my script, because this list is a little too long to realistically memorize and recite. So, here we go. Lewis used talking animals, wood nymphs, fauns and satyrs, a river god, maenads, dragons, werewolves, hags, witches, snake witches, an island that projects your greatest fears, dwarves, stars that are people, cannibalistic and non-cannibalistic giants, sea serpents, heck, Bacchus is in Prince Caspian. He used a Roman god in his books that are allegories for Christianity. I love it! On top of that, he created his own creatures like marshwiggles and dufflepuds. Lewis played so fast and loose with his lore that I don't remember if mermaids were in the books or if they were just in the movies, because it would make perfect sense. Lewis let anyone and everyone populate his world. If you can't tell, I really like C.S. Lewis. With Lewis and Tolkien, we see two completely different strategies in creating and adapting mythology. Which is better is honestly kind of a boring question. What's so cool about their friendship is that it shows that those two styles were not diametrically opposed. We can have and enjoy both. So, go out there and create your own mythology that's so dense that requires its own field of academic study, or borrow and create whatever you need to serve the story you're telling. I'll see you tomorrow, VEDS. May our stories outlive us all.